back in my student days, I had the chance to visit several museums with impressive collections of cold weapons. Out of the vast array of bladed weapons, the one that left the most impact on me was the Yatagan. There's something unique about this weapon, something that makes it stand out from the usual sabers, swords, and broadswords. But what exactly is a Yatagan, and is it better than a sword or saber? That's what we'll explore today. Humanity started experimenting with blade shapes way back when blades themselves first emerged, during the Bronze Age. And by the way, if you're already thinking that bronze couldn't have appeared before iron, being a complex alloy with tin, which is rare in nature, let's clarify a few things. First, copper has a melting point that's 400 to 500 degrees lower than steel. Second, ancient bronze was often an alloy of copper and arsenic, which was much more available. And third, there's a wealth of well-dated bronze artifacts and ancient ore mines that have been thoroughly studied. Nowadays, scientists can even pinpoint the origins and trade routes of copper thanks to metal analysis. By the Iron Age, in the first millennium BCE, ancient blacksmiths had already experimented with all the main blade shapes when making edged weapons. Essentially, if you're looking to design a long-bladed weapon, you have three main options. The simplest is to create a straight blade designed for chopping or chopping and thrusting. That's exactly what the first bronze swords were like, most likely evolving from daggers. The earliest examples appear around 6,000 years ago. Roughly 4,500 years ago, they took on the long, chopping and thrusting shape we recognize today. In truth, if you're after a cutting weapon, you won't come up with anything better than a simple, straight blade with a wedge-like cross-section. Otherwise, axes would probably look quite different today. While some axe blades have a slight curve to reduce the chances of getting stuck, the shape isn't meant to change the performance, but to enhance the cutting ability of a blade. You can make it more than just a chopping weapon, you can also make it a slicing one. A chopping and slicing weapon delivers a cut not just by hitting straight on, but by dragging the blade across the target as it cuts. To boost a blade's cutting effectiveness, you need to add a curve. In the second millennium BCE, Egyptian warriors started using the khopesh, essentially a cross between an axe and a saber, though sabers appeared much later. This weapon, despite being compact, around 2 feet in length, was heavy, weighing about 4 pounds. Interestingly, the Egyptians likely got the khopesh shape and even chariots from the Hyksos, who brought a bit of Indo-European democracy from the Asian steppes. In the first millennium BCE, swords, or rather large knives with concave blades and inner edge sharpening, known as falcon wing blades, began to spread. A famous example is the Greek kopis. This weapon could reach a length of about 2 feet, though shorter ones were more common. However, the Greeks weren't the inventors here. They likely borrowed the idea from the Middle East. Overall, the main takeaway is that weapons with sickle-like blades, or falcon wing shapes, have been known for ages. But today, the best-known examples are the Nepali kukri and the Turkish yatagan. The story of the Yatagan's origins is linked to a legend, which, like most legends, is somewhat detached from reality. As we know, from the 14th century, the Ottoman Empire had a rather harsh practice. The empire's conquered Christian population paid a blood tax, where some children were taken to be raised as soldier slaves, the Janissaries. Over time, the Janissaries became a political force within the empire, sometimes staging rebellions or palace coups, with no shortage of historical examples. According to legend, the Sultan banned Janissaries from carrying sabers in civilian settings, so they commissioned large knives, the Yatagans, which proved to be just as effective. In reality, the development of the Yatagan started in the 15th or 16th century, only becoming a popular weapon in the late 18th century and reaching peak popularity, along with myths, in the early 19th century. Although Janissaries weren't carrying sabers during peace, they did need a self-defense weapon, though this wasn't the primary reason the Yatagan spread. Despite the aura of mysticism and reverence surrounding it and other blade weapons, the Yatagan's history is more straightforward. Its mass adoption occurred in the latter half of the 18th century, when the empire was riddled with uprisings and Janissaries were tasked with dealing with the turmoil. Remember, the Janissaries were infantry, somewhat akin to European musketeers or Russian streltsy. The primary weapon of the Janissaries was originally the bow, which the Ottomans mastered. By the time the Yatagan became popular, they were using tufeks, the equivalents of muskets. The Janissaries also used heavier weapons like axes and polearms, but found these reduced mobility, making them less effective against rebels and guerrilla fighters. Besides, there was a clear trend in the 18th century of moving towards lighter infantry. edged weapons became secondary or even tertiary to firearms. Pikemen were becoming obsolete, and bayonets mounted on guns were the primary close combat weapon for infantry. Around this time in Russia, the streltsy were replaced by rifle-equipped light infantry with short swords or bayonets. In the Ottoman Empire, they used the yatagan instead of short swords. The yatagan itself was a relatively lightweight weapon, typically weighing under 2 pounds, with an overall length of about 2.5 feet, often shorter. Its signature features were its widening grip and the so-called ears. These ears helped reduce the chance of losing the weapon during a forward thrust and a pullback cut. Although some early versions lacked the ears, like the shashka, the yatagan has no handguard, which implies it's not a full-fledged fencing weapon. Its falcon wing blade shape is highly effective for chopping and slicing. But let's be real, it's a light weapon designed for use against unarmored or lightly armored opponents. Cutting through serious armor with a light yatagan was more difficult than with a heavier saber or sword. Besides lacking a guard, its concave blade didn't lend itself well to deflecting blows. With a saber or sword, an opponent's blade could slide off, reducing the chance of breaking. With the yatagan, such deflection was tricky, so parries were typically done with the back of the blade. Despite its legendary status, in reality, the yatagan delivered good chopping and slicing damage, though it wasn't as powerful as a heavier sword or saber. For example, modern kukris cut no better, and in some tests, even worse than similarly sized machetes. Additionally, to inflict maximum damage, the contact area with the opponent's body should be located closer to the middle of the blade. In contrast, sabers and shashkas can cut effectively with the last third, which is vital for mounted combat. In essence, the yatagan is a lighter, shorter weapon compared to the sword or saber, easy to mass produce, and thus affordable. Its design made it an excellent auxiliary weapon. It was relatively small, lightweight, and easy to carry. Plus, its curved blade increased its effective cutting length while still keeping it compact. A nice bonus was the fact that, unlike the saber, the blade and the grip were in a straight line, which made thrusting attacks more effective. This way, you could pierce an opponent wearing some light protection. Though again, the handle structure and the average blade thickness of around 1/8 of an inch weren't ideal for hard thrusting, but it should have been sufficient against leather armor or padded gambesons. In emergency situations, the yatagan could even be thrown at an enemy as an auxiliary weapon. Doing this with a primary weapon would be foolish, although I won't claim that yatagans were routinely thrown. It's also mentioned that if a Janissary or any other fighter planned to engage in a duel, he could use the saber as his primary weapon and the yatagan as a secondary one in his left hand. Overall, it's worth understanding that no amount of curve or blade shape variation can give an edged weapon an absolute advantage. Improvements in one area often mean drawbacks in another. Otherwise, one single shape would dominate worldwide. The yatagan's peak popularity in the Ottoman Empire and surrounding territories was in the 19th century. Many examples from this period that have survived feature elaborate decoration, but were made from low-quality metal with fragile, hollow handles. This suggests these items were often status symbols, rather than intended for active combat. In 1826, the Janissaries met a fate similar to the Russian streltsy, as potential rebels were disbanded. Their iconic weapon, at the height of its popularity, soon faded into history. The yatagan, like the shashka or even the katana, embodies the philosophy of quick and lethal strikes. However, while the shashka or katana can serve as standalone offensive weapons, the yatagan, like daggers or short swords, is better seen as a secondary weapon. Can you really compare the yatagan to a sword or saber? Probably not. It's essentially a type of light cleaver that became more common in the modern era. Similar weapons existed in the medieval period, but most were rarely considered primary weapons due to the more advanced protective gear of the time.